Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us at an online panel discussion hosted by Brookings India. I'm Rahul Tongia, fellow scholar at Brookings India, and delighted to have a very distinguished panel joining us to discuss this topic about DisComs post-COVID-19. We have with us Shri Subhash Garg, who was former Finance Secretary and also Secretary Ministry of Power. We have Shri Gireesh Pradhan, who has been Secretary MNRE, Special Secretary Ministry of Power, and after that, Chairman CERC, the most recent one who has demitted office, and Dr. Arun Verma, who was Joint Secretary Distribution at the Ministry of Power, and one of the driving forces for example, Saubhagya, the electrification scheme, and he headed distribution sector DisComs in the country. So we're delighted that you've joined us, everyone. And we hope for a very engaging discussion, because if there's anything that this current scenario has taught us from the world we're in right now, it's that we have to rethink what we were doing in the past, because the future will not look like the past. Now, distribution sector is the linchpin in some ways of the electricity sector, but some people have also called it the weakest link. India today has a surplus in some ways of generation capacity. That is no longer the main challenge. Managing the balancing, but also the financials is a very key aspect. And so we're here to really understand DisComs. And in some ways, distribution sector faced a lot of challenges in the past: financial, operational, technical. And so now the first question in many people's mind is, what is different post-COVID? And there are two time frames that people talk about. One is, of course, there's the crisis, there's the short term, we're still facing lockdowns, and then there's a recovery period. But after that, there's going to be maybe a new normal, and nobody knows what that may look like. It's unlikely we'll get to where we were. I want things to get back to normal. Well, what does normal mean? So instead, can we rethink what the new future could be, is another sort of open question to this panel. So again, thank you all for joining us. It is afternoon here in India, late afternoon, and there are registrants from the United States. So good morning to all of you. And in times like these, in the Corona era, humor is one thing that keeps us sane. So I'll just observe that for those of you, it's good morning, you can be in your pajamas. And for those of us on the panel, even, we could be in the pajamas on the lower half, perhaps. It is said that a crisis doesn't necessarily just create problems, it exposes them. So there were challenges before, and now there are additional challenges or new challenges or exacerbated challenges. And so to start us off, maybe I could request all of you to just give 1 or 2 minutes, quick opening thoughts of what people should think about when they think about DisComs, because DisComs are only one part of the electricity sector, a very important part, but energy is only one aspect of the multitude of changes, obviously health being the most important, strategic and security issues being important, and financial being very important. So just few opening thoughts very briefly before we dig into more of the details of the electricity sector and DisComs. Maybe I could request Mr. Garg to start us off with a bigger picture view or focused view as you see fit.
Thank you, Rahul. The lockdown imposed after the COVID-19 struck India and the entire world has been one of the most severe ones in our country. It affected a large part of the economy. A lot of people have estimated that about 70% of the economy remained non-functional during the first 40 days. And still something like 50% of the economy is still not on its feet. This is going to have a very major impact on the growth this year. A lot of people estimate that, and that also I also share that view, that there would be a contraction in the economy this year. This is bound to affect the power sector. So we saw something like 25 to 30% power demand reduction in this year compared to the last year in the month of April. This comes at a time when the power sector is in great problem itself. There are large amounts of outstanding bills which the DisComs have to pay to the generation companies and all. There are various estimates, but something close to about a lakh crore plus is said to be outstanding. DisComs also have to receive from the state governments and all. That's a different kind of story. But in all, and that has been my assessment for quite some time, that the DisComs in India have been practically insolvent for last 25 years. They have been bailed out from one by one package to another. Sometimes we had Monte Carlo aliasing bonds, then FRP, and then Uday bonds, where Arun Verma was deeply involved, and quite a kind of these things. This situation becomes far more complex, more difficult, because I'm told that the DisComs are not able to collect even their normal bills during this period. So I see the post-COVID, and one doesn't even know when that new normal or the real post-COVID situation will be there, when the economy is uh, close to normal. I don't expect it to be normal anytime soon. Let's put that time somewhere close to July. So after first three, I think there would be a tougher time to take a lot of decisions. The tough decisions is something which will have to be taken. We've looked for very short-term solutions for quite some time. I don't think short-term can carry on. 25 years of experimentation should teach us that we need to get the real solutions. I think I'll stop at this stage, at this point. I see the situation quite serious, more grim than it was when the COVID started for the power sector. Thank you.
Thank you. We will definitely dig into the long-term needs and the long-term solutions. Mr. Pradhan, any reactions, thoughts, or opening thoughts, please?
Thank you. Thank you, Rahul. Thank you for having me. And I would just like to basically focus on the immediate. And I think that is what's really the crucial question. As Mr. Garg said, we are going through an unprecedented crisis. It's only going to, or it has already accelerated the situation for the DisComs. But before that, I'd like to just say that we mustn't forget that it is the DisComs who are no less as part of the essential services as the corona warriors whom we are saluting. So I think a lot of kudos should go to the DisComs. DisComs have been for ages memorial the whipping boy, the favorite whipping boy of all of us, in the ministry, in the state governments, everywhere. Be that as it may, I am not apportioning blame, nor am I holding a candle out for the DisComs. But in the short term, and I am not going to be brave enough to lay any claims about the long term or even the medium term. I have a feeling, and that's personal, that the way this particular pandemic and this crisis, almost catastrophic, is going to play out, not many people are aware of how things are going to go. And it would be really, really a very, very brave person who would make any kind of projections on that score. Be that as it may. One of the crucial things that DisComs play in the power sector is that is the only place where the cash register rings. For the entire sector, the lifeblood comes from the DisComs, number one. Number two, whatever past sins, let us not get onto the bandwagon of trying to strong arm or discipline the DisComs at this stage. This is a stage when the DisComs need support, they need assistance, and they need to be reassured in terms of the immediate future. A number of steps could be taken such that we could get the DisComs to play a crucial role. Imagine demand has fallen by almost 30+%. Their collections are now dismal. They are not able to collect even in the higher end of domestic or industrial consumers. The economy itself, as Mr. Garg was mentioning, has gone through a really period of real contraction. The aim in the short term, and I think the government is absolutely right in what it's doing, is to try and kickstart the economy. We have to get the economy back on track. And trying to get back the economy on track requires an important input, which is power. Also, it is the cost of power which is going to be crucial. So the way I see it is that all around haircuts will have to be taken, number one. That's without doubt and without question. And the second is not to take this opportunity to jump on an already hurt and in pain DisCom sector. Let's first get this crisis over with in the short term, which is 3 months, 6 months. Before I end, I'd just like to say that it's now a time to keep the boat steady and not rock the boat. We need the boat to be steadied. And in that, whatever support and assistance the DisComs would require would be something which would be very, very crucial. I think I'll stop with that. We can look at the details later.
Thank you. So, I mean, there is a lot of learning of the COVID where people have said, fight the disease, not the patient. And so that could be the analogy that people think of. Before I turn to you, Verma, sir, Dr. Verma, just a message for our audience and participants online. We have a question and answer box or a method you can use online to start sending them. We will be triaging them because of the large number of participants. It's not a live open mic system. So please do keep your questions very brief and focused. If they are for a particular panelist, note that as well. So as you hear something that raises a question, do share your questions. We hope to dedicate time towards the end for Q&A. Some folks have sent them in advance. Unfortunately, we cannot guarantee we'll get to everything. And if you have a question, please do share any relevant points, who you are, or in case you've signed in using a pseudonym or an anonymous, if you wish to share that information. Now, to you, Dr. Verma, because we do have this balancing act. We literally have the short-term need, and then we want long-term fixes. So maybe that's just one other input for you to dwell on, maybe now or later.
Thank you, Dr. Tongia. Mr. Garg and Mr. Pradhan both have already given you the overall picture of how the DisComs are doing. But then I have just 2-3 points to make at the outset. The first thing that country needs better quality of power even during the COVID, because most of the people are locked down in the houses. So you need 24/7 supply so that their communication system goes on, their entertainment goes on, their IT-enabled services goes on. And not only that, even in the hospitals and everywhere, if you need some essentials to be produced, to be transported, your communication, your healthcare, they all require good quality power supply. So, and the job of this job is done by the distribution company. Therefore, their act is much more vital even during the COVID. We'll talk something what will happen to the post-COVID also. Say the entire situation is not a making of the DisComs. It has happened to our country, to the whole globe. And as very well explained, that the economy has contracted, and the direct impact is seen in the financial of the power sector's utilities also. Not only the DisCom, it is also on the say transmitters, and it is also on the generators. In March, arrears, all our pending dues, and right from 20th onward, semblance of a lockdown and things were being talked, and the production reduced also. So power started going down, but post 22nd, it went quite low. It went almost from 165 gigawatt to 120 gigawatt. Now it has again picked up, during the lockdown 3.0, but still it is not going more than 135. So this contraction of demand means the contraction of paying consumptions, means industrial consumptions as well as the commercial consumption. And the DisCom model runs on two kinds of subsidy. One is subsidy from the government, the other is the cross subsidy from the industrial and the commercial consumers, because most agricultural supply as well as the domestic supply is much cheaper than those two categories. So therefore, there is a clear-cut contraction of the source of business for the DisCom. One, the other is the consumers, otherwise also the domestic consumers or say agricultural consumers who could have paid their bill, or even the say continuous process industries or the other essential industries which are running today, who could have paid their bill, they are not paying. I have my personal information that collection has reduced by almost 75%, 70 to 75%. Normally, the revenue of the DisComs in our country at present is 7,20,000 crore, almost 60,000 crore a month, and it has reduced by almost 75%. And earlier month also they have reduced. So, and this is going to be the case, I understand, up to Q3. Only in Q4 you can expect something to improve better, because this demand can go up to say 150, 155 gigawatt. Still, but energy consumption is very low. Reason being that the industries are not running round the clock. They are running under capacity because of the social distancing and many other norms. Therefore, even if the demand goes up, the energy consumption will remain much lower. So in these circumstances, the entire value chain, not only the DisCom, but the transmitter as well as the generator will be affected. So when we think about DisCom, we have to think that they are the interface with the consumer of the entire power sector. They are the interface with the consumer. If consumers are in trouble, the entire sector is in trouble. We have to help them out at this juncture of time. Short-term strategy should consist in helping them out to sail through this situation, remain steady, and post-COVID, when you have you pick up your economy and everything, there can be some reform measures can be taken to restructure the DisCom, because DisCom business as such is not viable in this country. The cost of supply is much higher than the revenue that you get it. 85% of the cost goes towards the power purchase. Power lending cost of the power is increasing day by day. So you have to think something different. This model is not going to survive. So post-COVID would have a different normal. At this juncture, I'll say this much, and we'll discuss it further also. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we get to a few questions and the topics, I just wanted to share some reactions to things said so far to really get the juices flowing. Clearly, the government was one of the biggest owers to DisComs of bill payments. And so now the governments are going to be cash strapped. So priorities is one question that's a larger macro question on the economy. You mentioned that the bill collection has come down, but how much of that may just be temporary? Because obviously when it's locked down, the physical act of collecting bills is low. The demand has also fallen. And then you've got the additional layer that the demand from commercial and industrial is what has fallen, the so-called paying customers or the cross-subsidizing customers. So is this simply is much of the pain only temporary, meaning by July, June, July was thrown out as a possibility? So it's a liquidity problem. Yes, there's a long-term solvency problem. Like Dr. Verma said, the viability is a longer term, but we were muddling along thus far. So can we at least get back to some semblance of an equilibrium in a short term? Is it just a very short-term thing? And a parallel question to that, maybe Mr. Garg, a lot of people talk about this fall as a comeback in a V-shaped recession. So it's a collapse, but do you think that it will be a V, either on the fiscal side, economy side, or on the power side? Just one question.
See, there is no possibility in my judgment of a V-shaped recovery for two reasons. Number one, a lot of businesses are going to be very severely impaired. Those businesses cannot come back to normal in any case. Look at travel, tourism, transportation, entertainment, sports. A lot of these businesses will struggle to get to even 50% of what they were doing. If this business contributes even 10 to 15% of our total GDP, that is not going to come back even when the normal rate of economic performance returns. Second, what we have seen so far, 50 days of the lockdown, so to say now, it is the industry is struggling. Industry is struggling to come back, even where it has been permitted to operate now. For various reasons, the factories have not come back to the normal. Either the supply chain is not complete in this world of global supply chains, and otherwise it becomes difficult, or the permissions. Now we have unfortunately brought upon ourselves a kind of huge license permit Raj into the system. Our concern is genuine. We have to protect the health and all, but its consequence, collateral damage, is the industrial and the economic function. So I don't think anywhere soon we will have a recovery. And when you can't have a recovery very soon, it can't be V-shaped. V assumes that at a point of time, next day or next month or next quarter, you start recovering very well. I don't think it's going to be the case. It will be longer. In economic terms, a lot of people talk about the second alternative, a U-shaped. That looks like to me a more of a possibility, but I don't even see the upper end of the right side of the U equaling to the left side of the upper end of the U. It will be contraction.
For how long?
I think 1 quarter is practically loss. So you have 25% to 30%, maybe a little more loss of output in the quarter one. For the quarter two, it's difficult to hazard how does the whole thing pan out. You don't know whether the COVID-19 risk will be contained fully. This is a very vicious kind of virus. It might come back more severely than what it is today. So it's very difficult to say. But if you assume a scenario that in the quarter two, it will not be as virulent and as damaging, and we will come back to something more of a normal side, then even quarter two would see about 15 to 20% loss of output. Third quarter maybe we come somewhere close to, but I don't see the recovery or the growth over the last year any time before the quarter four. That's my broad sense of the economy.
Rahul, if I may, with your permission.
Please, please.
See, the problem is at least the government is trying to kickstart the economy. That's what I've heard. If I'm wrong, please correct me. But the government is trying to kickstart the economy. We're hearing things about financial stimulus and other such things. Now, the whole idea is to get the industry manufacturing started. They are in a really bad shape as it is. So they would be going out of their way, trying to get resources together, trying to get the wherewithal together, trying to get their people together. And somebody mentioned, with the new social distancing and other such these things, how to get manufacturing restarted or industrial production restarted is going to be a crucial aspect. Anybody will tell you that one of the most important inputs is power. And cost of power for industry is crucial. And those of us who know that industrial tariff or tariff to manufacturing industry commercial has been one of the highest, because that's the way we have been building up this model of cross subsidy. This is not going to go away immediately. So what we need to concentrate, at least the government needs to concentrate on, is to think of novel ways in which you can, in the short term, I'm not talking about this in a long-term perspective, I'm talking about short-term, because I think the crucial thing is to get the economy going at the earliest. And one of the main inputs is going to be the power cost. And the only way you are going to be able to reduce that is by interventions. You can give it any name. I'm not an economist, otherwise I can give a flowery name or whatever, financial stimulus or whatever. But you need to lower the cost so that manufacturing industry, when it starts off, has a tariff which feeds into it. It doesn't have to be overly burdensome to them the way it was. That will do, I think, a lot of good in terms of getting the industry manufacturing back on track. And there are a few solutions that could be thought of. If you want, I can elaborate, but...
Can I add to what Mr. Pradhan was saying? There is one opportunity which is likely to emerge and which has some connection to power sector in my judgment. There is now a lot of aversion to do trade and get manufacturing done in China. There is a real possibility of some of the production getting shifted out from China. The question would be that can India capitalize on it? Can India take advantage of it? And in that connection, it's my understanding that we have so far not been able to capitalize on it and taken advantage of it. And for that, one of the factors responsible is the very excessive cost of power charged to the industry. That is what Mr. Pradhan was making that point. Now, it's a time, to my mind, to review the whole policy of this cross-subsidization of power. We, unfortunately, in the country, price the power for consumers at a very low level, and we overcharge the industry. This makes our industry non-competitive. There are other elements of non-competitiveness as well, but power is one of the major components. If we can fix the power sector, and now we have a situation in the country where we have generation capacity which is at least 3 times at what the normal demand is. So there is no shortage of power. Why can't we capitalize on volume? And that volume can come only from the industry. If you supply power to industry at a lower rate or at the cost, not overcharge rate, then the chances of industry demand coming to power sector, to DisComs, is much higher. This is also the opportunity for the industry to sort of say goodbye to the costly power they produce on their own by using diesel generating sets, etc. That demand can also be used by the DisComs if they price the power reasonably and assure the assured supply to them. So I think there are opportunities there. The second element is this small MSME industry. They are the worst sufferer of this crisis. If we can reach power to them, and I would suggest, I normally don't recommend any subsidization to any segment of industry or consumers. But if some segment deserves in this hour of need to get some support for power, it can be delivered through another means. It is the MSMEs. I think if we can do these two things, then probably we'll do much better for both the DisComs as well as for the industry to take advantage of, which can come our way. Thank you.
Rahul, can I make some remark on this subject? First thing is that if we consider that economy is going to be hit by something 12 to 15% of the GDP, I mean, you can't expect power sector to have lesser impact. You are going to have a little bigger impact on it. The second is that there is no chance of revival of the fullest. The industry cannot go to fullest scale before Q3. I'm sure Q4 only you can, because yesterday only Mr. Randeep Guleria has made a comment that the spike and the peak in India is going to come in June, July. So if pandemic is still in rising mode, and we are going to witness the peak in June and July, so up to Q3 there is no chance. Mr. Pradhan has made a very right point that if industry has to recover, we must give them some kind of concession, some kind of facilitation that they come up. And so price of power should be reduced. Say there are chances, there are 2-3 opportunities that price of power can be reduced. One is that the movement, say the movement of the people have been reduced, and therefore the cross subsidy that railway does for the fare versus freight. Now they have not to do much in the fare, so they can reduce the freight. The whole transportation cost can be reduced. The fuel surcharge has been reduced, and Gujarat has reduced its fare, its tariff by 16 paise per unit 3 days back, because the fuel surcharge has gone down. The ROE, the rate, the return on the equity, particularly in the transmission sector, is much higher. They can reconsider, because the risk and rewards are not equally distributed along the entire value chain of the power sector. Most of the generators are, say, selected through LC. A transmitter works on the cost plus regime. And the entire risk is at the boundary, where the poor DisCom have to indulge with the consumers. Consumers are in a poor state these days because of this COVID and everything. Therefore, there would be certain brunt, and that brunt must be shared by others, say, in the upstream stakeholders. So by these methods, we can reduce the cost of power at present. The another thing is the liquidity issue. There are 2 opportunities. One is that more than 44,000 crore, I understand, is the government dues. Government departments owes these dues towards the DisCom. They should pay back just immediately. All state governments have to.
But sir, if they didn't pay before Corona, do they have the cash to pay now?
Fine. Listen, that is a overall economic situation. All state governments are financially stressed, and government of India has to come, and a lot of economic ideas are coming, that you print more money, you borrow a lot, you go beyond the FRBM, and all those things are much bigger picture. And Mr. Garg is a much more a greater expert to comment on that than what I can. But then these are some methods. You can inject some liquidity through that, some low-cost financing to the DisComs, so that they pay back the GenCo's dues and the entire circle moves. That can be done immediately. One more thing, the economy just to take advantage of the leverage of having some manufacturing capacity here, which are shifting from China, and establishment, the location finalization, establishment of industry takes not less than 12 to 18 months time. So you can't expect that this is going to revive your economy within the period of a year or so. This will help you, but post certain periods, and that period could be after 1.5 years only. My sense is like that. So at present, if you want to revive your economy, continue your power supply system steady, good quality, then you have to inject certain liquidity in that. There are two ways. One is giving some cheap finance. And a lot of liquidity is available with the banks and even with the, say, NBFC in the power sector can help them. And the second is that paying off their dues by the government. If the government pays off to the DisCom would be in a position to pay off to the GenCo, and the system will move. That method can be taken up this time. And so one more point about the cross subsidy. It is a big case. The underground mining.
So Mr. Verma, sorry, we'll come back to cross subsidies in just a second, since that deserves, there's a lot of questions from the audience. If it's all right, can we come back to that
Okay, fine.
Yeah. Mr. Pradhan, you had a point
Rahul,
to make. Yeah.
No, just one. I'm taking forward Vermaji's arguments. Of course, he's not talking about the elephant in the room. This is basically the price of coal. Price of coal is an administered price. And 75% of the cost of electricity is fuel, which is coal. Now, if the government were to reduce the price of coal by a certain percentage, maybe they can call it financial stimulus or whatever it is, but that would be a very, very major impact on the price of electricity. That's one. Number two is, of course, Vermaji mentioned only the transmission part of it on the ROE, but I would say, and I think there is a case over the next 6 months to look at the return on equity of many of the GenCos. After all, 15% in today's day is a very high percentage. So I'm not saying you reduce it forever. I'm being a regulator. I know there is, a certain amount of regulatory predictability that is required. But these are extraordinary times. These are drastic times. And for a short period of say 6 months or 8 months, if we can slash the return on equity, then we take care of the fixed charges as far as the cost of power is concerned. Because there's already a moratorium on the debt part. So the fixed charges consist of nothing but the return on equity and the debt repayment. So we take care of that. That part goes out. As far as the fuel, the variable cost is concerned, if we are able to reduce coal price, then we have a situation where power is cheaper. And I'm not talking about attracting, in the short term, attracting industry from elsewhere. I'm talking about my own industry, which is going to find it a major problem trying to get on its feet. Especially, as Mr. Garg mentioned, the SMSE. I mean, they are really, going to face a very, very uphill task, trying to get their people together, trying to get the resources to start, get the supply organized. And if electricity, which is a crucial component, is reduced, then you can see the impact it's going to have on kickstarting the economy.
So if we had to, just as an example, say that, well, the problem is, if you're in a surplus world, it's very easy to say, oh, I deserve it. And it's easy to have fights. But when you're struggling and then now go further negative, how do you apportion that? So one analogy is, if you need a stimulus or whatever fancy term, so to speak, who would get it? So you want to maybe be cautious that if I'm paying from the central government, because that's one theory that the states are more cash strapped. So is that to pay off the old dues? Is that to reduce the price for certain users? So one suggestion sort of thrown out was, why don't we remove the cross-subsidy surcharge for MSMEs so that they're not paying for what is a policy or political decision and more cost-reflective? So that's a viable manner for, at least from an end-user perspective, which is actually microeconomically somewhat efficient as well. Or do we just not have that breathing room to make such things happen?
Rahul, can I intervene?
Please.
You said, as rightly pointed out by Mr. Pradhan, that the largest cost of the supply is the power purchase cost. We have 369 gigawatt of capacity today installed in our country. And our peak is not more than 183 gigawatt till now. So obviously we have surplus capacity. And we have surplus tied capacity also. So whatever we need, we have already gone for PPA of much larger capacity. So those capacity will remain idle during this period when your production is going low and all those things. And your DisComs would be paying for the fixed cost. And then you will be adding to your tariff. Either you hike the tariff to commensurate to this, or you will incur a loss on the DisComs book of account. So there is a case that you relook at your power purchase agreements of DisComs. And another point, Rahul, all our DisComs are not in the same boat. Some are much better, having a much better consumer mix. Some have a very primitive consumer mix, means a small consumers, a very low consuming consumers. They are not very high paying consumers. Region, and some are in a doable conditions, viable condition. So every DisCom should be analyzed separately to give them financial help, or to find out a solution of their financial stress, or to give them solution as to how they should operate to move steadily and support the rising economy or reviving economy, recovering economy in our country.
So are there open question to everyone. Are there other elephants in the room? Mr. Pradhan used that term, the one of the elephants, but we have many elephants actually in the room. Agriculture is one of them. But on this particular topic that you had flagged, there is this issue of, for example, and with surpluses, power exchanges. The price of power in the power exchanges has obviously collapsed. But yet the PPAs are one reason that we have not been able to take advantage of it without calling force majeure. So the first implication of that is, who gets to call force majeure? And is this a valid one? And how does that propagate in the economics? Because it's very hard to have an essential service that's in a chain without every part doing their role. And the second is, then this prompts the question, especially as we look to the future, where we will have more renewable energy coming in. How do we handle the PPAs? Is this the time to relook at it? Or is this the time just to put in, let's call it stimulus money, or let's call it stopgap money, or some temporary funding to just tide us over? Like, how do you see that playing out? An open question.
So if you, I think we should keep the broader financial balance sheet of the power sector in mind when we debate and discuss the questions like PPA or coal prices, or for that matter, the margins of or return on equity of the generators and all. These are not exact numbers, but I'll give you a very broad brush picture of the balance sheet of the power sector. Power sector has roughly about 7 lakh crores of the final priced power, or the power revenue, so to say. About 1/3 of that, roughly about 2 lakh crores, they don't collect. They were not collecting even before the COVID hit it. That is the kind of gross and big loss into the system. The state governments support something like 50% of that 1 lakh crores by means of various kind of subsidies and all. The rest remains uncovered, which is what is reflected in unpaid bills and things like that, and the losses of the power sector. That is the kind of grim situation we are dealing with. Now, in this, if we suggest a solution like renegotiating PPA, number one, they are contracts. They can't be renegotiated at the behest of one party.
But isn't this force majeure? I mean, literally.
Yeah, so force majeure again, there are interpretational issues, but suppose for the short time, you say that you are not able or you're not obliged to pay for the power at the PPA cost. Who does it get affect? 65% or 80% power is supplied by the public sector, not by the private sector. The private sector supplies only about 20% of power still at the most. So it will hit the margins of the generators like NTPC and others. NTPC makes up in a year total profits about 10,000 crores. On a loss where you have 2 lakh crores of losses, even if you take away the entire 10,000 crores of profit and make the NTPC a loss-making company, you will not be able to touch even a fraction of the power sector losses. So we are sitting on a huge, big problem. I don't think any tinkering kind of solution would help. We must go for the real final solutions. That is what is needed. I understand this is not the time when you are hit by one crisis of the COVID-19. You're struggling to keep things go on, even meeting people and arranging labor, etc. But that is what we need to keep it in mind for the final solution in the power sector. I don't think temporary. In the temporary phase, if there is some additional assistance, maybe let us say 25,000 crore of the losses which the power sector or DisComs have suffered additionally during the period of 2 months or 3 months. The only port of call is the state governments. I understand and I know the state government finances are in a terribly big shape. Most of these states could not collect even 20% of their revenues in the month of April. They are struggling, they have huge problems, right? It is difficult for them in a normal year to meet the requirements, and in an abnormal year like this. And that is where the lender of the last resort or the provider of the last finance is the central government, which has the facility of borrowing. I think that is where the monetization logic comes in. If the monetization logic is not agreed because of the fear of inflation or whatever, the least which can be done is to permit the state governments to borrow more. You had originally referred to the question of prioritization, who gets it? I don't think power sector would have that kind of priority over health and other issues or the livelihood issues of a lot of people who are affected. But certainly power sector can come in somewhere to get some part of this extra borrowings which the states should be permitted.
So just to clarify, you are advocating either a temporary or a tweak or even an update of FRBM?
That is the only solution available short of the central government providing a stimulus-based grant support to the state government. So FRBMs will have to be tweaked. I see no possibility of this scenario not actually emerging in or turning into an actual thing. It has to be done. Sooner it will be done, the better. We have no escape. Very soon you will have to see the FRBM Acts maybe to be relaxed. The question would be how much, whether we do it 0.5% or 1% or 2% this year. That would be the question, not whether the FRBM Acts are to be relaxed. These are to be relaxed.
So one of the counter questions, I'm actually now folding in questions from the audience because we have many of them. But one is we do for example, relaxation a little bit to come to a temporary or at least the short term, which as Mr. Pradhan rightly pointed out is very critical. But how do we then align whatever we do to nudge us in the right direction? We may or may not fix this mess with tweaks. Like you rightly said, tinkering won't solve the problem. But whatever we inject, liquidity-wise or policy-wise or pricing changes, for example, waiver of cross-subsidy surcharge for certain industry, whatever it may be, should at least be in the direction that we wanted to go, as opposed to paying off the past sins. So two of the specific questions were, would this otherwise reduce the appetite for renewable or sustainable energy, which is a longer term objective and has other values? And similarly, on the rationalizing of tariffs, how do we see that playing out? Now, I'll just mention for the audience that for those of you who may not know, Central Ministry of Power has draft notification for amendments to the Electricity Act, 2003 Electricity Act. There are proposed amendments, and these are under discussion right now, publicly and privately. Now, whether or not they come through is one thing, but is that enough? I think the amendments are themselves worthy of a whole separate discussion. Perhaps I could invite one or more of you to come back for that aspect. But one of the key aspects of that really is one of these elephants in the room, to borrow your phrase, Mr. Pradhan, is this cross-subsidy regime. How can we not just say, I want to fix it because of temporary, but whenever we are doing a fix because desperate times call for desperate measures, then can we get it towards the long-term fix? So A, what is that long-term that is needed? And B, how does that align with the short-term need? Because if we can get the short-term need and the long-term objectives to align, that's going to be the real magic.
I think Mr. Pradhan wanted to come in.
I think, Rahul, that's a $1 million question. And if you find the answer to that, you'll probably win the lottery.
It keeps academics like us busy, sir.
Yeah, I'm sure. But I am not going to get into that issue. I'm looking only at, I'm not looking beyond my nose, as they say. Because as many of us have pointed out, the woes of the power sector are decades long. This is not a problem that has come up immediately. Okay, number one. Number two, there's a long history of how DisComs have behaved, DisComs have acted, how state governments have acted, and what have been the priorities. Now, if you are looking for a solution at this stage, which is going to address all of that, I'm sorry. I mean, I don't think that's in the realms of the possible. All I'm trying to say is that let's look at the present. Let's get this economy, which is down by, I think Garg Saab is the doctor on this, I think 40%? No, kitna, 40 or more down. Let's get it somewhere up to at least, if not 100%, at least near the 70-80 mark. That's the crucial issue right now, getting the small manufacturers, the industry started off. To the extent possible, whatever can be done in the short term needs to be done. After you are in some kind of a, not equilibrium, but in a steadier situation, you can all sit down and have a fresh look de novo at everything. And I'm sorry, you would have to include a lot of things which generally are taboo to be looked at.
Elephants.
Yeah, Rahul, very interesting discussion is going on. Let me share a few facts about the power sector. On the PPP pricing, the domestic power supply cost tariff in India is lower than only Brazil and higher than all important countries in the world. Much higher than China, much higher than US. So if you consider the common consumer of the country, raising the price of the domestic power supply or agriculture, which you otherwise also want to subsidize, is very, very difficult. It's only the matter of process that you can take it to make it more efficient. You do not want to subsidize it, but you want to give the direct benefit and things like that, which is a matter of different debate. I'll share the 2-3 facts that during this COVID, to facilitate the consumers and the common citizen, state governments or the government of India, they are coming up with so many things like, say, waiver of the fixed charges for the period it has been closed for the industrial consumers and things like that. Now, if a DisCom has to waive that, how can DisCom pay to the others? Similarly, you are deferring the payment term. Okay, you pay after 3 months or 2 months. There is a moratorium on the payment of the bills also. If you are doing that, so the cost of financing is going to be added to the loss of the DisCom. So if these facilities are to be given to the consumer, the state has to bear it. Either a state, if a state is a cash strapped, it should borrow from other where it should go to the government of India, bring the money, but you can't blame DisComs for that. You have to assist them, support them. The second point is that inefficiency of the DisCom. Fine, I mean, that is one thing which has to be removed by all means. But inefficiency of the infrastructure that you have, you cannot remove. That requires much more capital investment, and this is not the time for it. The rise of the price rise, the tariff hiking and all is also have a limitation that I have already pointed you out. Now, what is the way out then? How to manage this situation? So in this situation, you will have to go for the micro analysis of different DisCom. A DisCom in Gujarat can survive on its own because the consumer mix is such that there are industrial, there are commercial, there are say domestic as well as the agriculture. But there are DisComs. You go to the DisCom of Bihar, there is hardly any industrial consumer to cross-subsidize and things like that. So you have to think a different solution for different DisComs, even in the short term and for the long term when we go for the overall haul. Another point is that these DisComs are not acting exactly in a commercial way. You are forced, the political economy of the powers, political economy of electricity is altogether decided by the different factors. And these factors are not under the control of the DisCom managers. So those who are controlling it, and if you are trying to make it go in different direction, you will have to do for it. So state government must chip in, and they will have to bring money from wherever there is no way out.
If I can join in, Mr. Pradhan was rightly emphasizing the short term, which is extremely important in the context. How do you handle? Because when we are trying to do today, when we are trying to assess how the industry is affected, how the SMEs are affected, how the labor is affected, there is a right point that how is the power sector affected, that also needs to be looked after. But that's a very, very valid concern and point. I don't seem to have heard the Ministry of Power or the state governments devoting much time to this aspect. What one has heard recently more is about bringing about some amendment in the Electricity Act to enforce the contracts to make payments under PPAs, an absolute kind of obligation, which is then liable to be taken to the appellate tribunals and things like that. So it's more of an enforced payment security mechanism. And the other proposal one has heard is to make the PFC and the REC come up with a package of about 90,000 crores to give operational loans to the DisComs to pay off their generators and all. These solutions, my only fear is that these are not the right solutions even for the short term. These are the solutions which are supposed to address the long-term ailment in the sector. They don't address, in my judgment, that long-term ailment. So these solutions are not right solutions for even short-term or for the long-term. We should use this opportunity or this time to provide some short-term support, which I discussed earlier. The only port of call, the only agency which can provide for that is the state governments. I don't see any other possibility. Let's leave it to the state governments and DisComs how to take care of that short term. But for the long term, to my mind, I think we should realize that retaining the DisComs in the power, in the public sector in this manner, with such large losses being there inherently in the sector, is perhaps not the way to go forward. I think we should initiate some reforms. We discussed about cross subsidy. being removed, we should also think about leaving the private sector industry buy powers from the private sector directly, not burden the moral dilemma of the DisComs that you have to provide them power at a higher cost. And I think initiate long-term measures to increasingly pass on the distribution to the private sector. That is, if we can initiate, that is something which we can probably find a longer-term solution.
So a lot of people have asked that privatization has been one of the things people talk about for the DisComs. Generation, of course, has been open to the private sector since '91. Now, one of the guidelines is efficiency that the private sector is supposed to bring in, but it's also capital. But now in this current day and age, when you have constraints on capital, but you also have distractions, in the sense, it's probably more likely to have a public sector entity state-owned with balance sheets that have revolving games and all sorts of play, because a private sector person is not going to stand up for deficit financing that the way public sector could have done. And this has been heard in not just the power sector. You've got issues of strategic, that you want more national entities. Globally, people are talking about this. Do you think that there is going to be a potential pause to how we see the private sector playing a role in this, or is that reading too far?
If I can respond to you on this, see, the distribution business actually is a cash business. It's not a risky business. It's the way we have operated it, that it has become a sort of bottomless, less pit kind of thing. Otherwise, it's as good a cash business as a telecom service business is, or something like this.
Vodafone would like to have a word with you, sir.
If you, sorry?
Vodafone would like to have a word with you, sir.
No, so that is where they suffer. So in the private sector, if some is inefficient one, and by the way, Vodafone is also not a cash problem. It's a investment problems which have created the loss-making situation for them, right? And the overcharges which they have to suffer. The private sector, the resolution takes it faster. You can't resolve Air India, but you have resolved the jet if it has fallen on the base side. So that is so I have no sympathy for the private sector falling apart and getting bankrupt in the sector. But what I see, and that is more likely to happen in generation and others, distribution, if you price it rightly, it's a cash business. Chances of private sector investing in a distribution business is much more than anything else. That is what my sense is.
So on that same vein, sorry, Mr. Verma.
Dr. Tongia, this COVID has given an opportunity for many private sector to come here in the power sector, because here you can maintain the social distance, you can work on that, and distribution business can go with that. So private sector, if though the people are not fully engaged in the, say, manufacturing and all, they can come here. But then the most important thing is that there are certain requirements which should be done before you privatize your DisComs. Like in our country, the domestic rural consumer in many of the states are still on flat rate tariff, not metered also. Unless you meter them, unless you measure the consumption, no private sector is going to survive there. So inviting them in a business where they are bound to fail is also a very difficult job. Otherwise, here a state government has to, or the DisCom, which is state owned, is having all these losses to their own credit. So some essential is to be done also. And private sector is also not showing that kind of appetite for all the DisComs. Region may be things like this only. So you have to find out both way, which are the DisCom where the appetite is there. And if you want them to go in this certain DisComs where they can improve and all, what are the benefits, what are the viability gap funding or support you can give to them? I think both the things are required.
Rahul, if I may, just a last point, I think. Let's not get carried away by the fact that privatization will solve everything. And let's also not brush all the DisComs that we have. 95% are in the state sector. tar them with one brush. Verma ji is in a state where the DisComs have shown a wonderful ability to run a tight ship and have done well. Similarly, there are other such states in which the DisComs have not performed too badly. Also, it is not necessary that the private sector will enter all those areas where presently the state DisComs are operating under adverse circumstances. You set everything on stage and then the private sector will come. Obviously, they're going to have a great... Tell them to take on 90% rural area and 10% urban. None of them will come forward because they know. So which is the entity of last resort? It is the DisCom, the state DisCom. The power sector has shown us that public sector investment in the power sector has been efficient and has been one of the best. For example, look at NTPC. It's a public sector. Today, it's ranked as one of the top companies in the world. Look at Power Grid. Again, a public sector which is ranked number 3 in the world. So it's not as if privatization will be one master stroke and sort out all the problems. Yes, it will enter, private sector will enter where there is a profit. Don't tell me that the private sector wants to enter an area for public good and for social service, and doesn't matter. They are there for the bottom line. Unless they can see the bottom line clearly, they're not going to enter into it. So who's there? It's only my state governments, DisComs, which are there. And frankly, I mean, we can spend another seminar on this, but I don't think that the DisComs are as sinning as sinned against. And Verma ji will bear me out. There are many things which are not in the DisCom's hands, which they have to do. So let's not just tar the DisComs with the same kind of brush. Okay, thanks.
So we've got lots of questions. I'll come to a few more of them from the audience. But the last sort of one, agreed, the short term versus long term, there is that challenge. But isn't it one more issue? Because this comes back to the heart of the question, as you said, Mr. Pradhan, what is the objective function? Private guy will make money. That's their objective function. But now let's assume in today's world, to use the cash phraseology that Mr. Garg pointed out, if the DisCom does what it's supposed to, they will collect cash and make a certain rate of return. It's a regulated entity. It's not a competitive retail market space for the most part in India. So excluding force majeure and corona for a second, let's assume something goes wrong or something changes, maybe due to technology, renewables, open access. So many changes are occurring in the landscape before COVID came along. The only thing that happens today is the DisCom goes to you, the regulator, and says, okay, you know what? My consumer mix has changed. My cost structure has changed. My revenue has changed. We will do a true up, or we'll have an ARR change over time. Now, one of the larger questions that we may not be able to answer is, if it wasn't working before, is that going to work going forward? And that's a very tricky, almost rhetorical question, unless someone wants to jump into that minefield. But two questions. One, a lot of folks have asked about renewable energy. Renewables were liked a lot when they are cheap compared to greenfield coal. Renewables look very cheap, of course. But what Mr. Verma pointed out is we have a fair amount of capacity already. Some of it tied up as already. So do we think that the current situation is going to diminish the appetite for renewable energy? Someone has asked this question about jobs, because renewable energies are a capital play and the manufacturing is often done outside India. How do we see that being part of this calculus? Any thoughts on the sustainability argument, the equilibrium and renewable energy?
So if I can come in on this, the renewables have been driven by basically two major factors. One is the falling cost of renewable power generation. We have seen this coming to very, very low levels and all. And second, that there is a demand in the country for power. We were a power deficit country. The second situation seems to have changed quite a lot in last. I don't think we are still operating at the optimal level of economic consumption of power, but that's a different story. The fact remains that we have more power generation capacity than what is the current consumption demand. So that's no longer a driver. And that in fact becomes now an inhibitor, that you put in more power generation on renewable side to capture some side of the market, which is not the case. Now the cost reduction driver still operates, and therefore, in my judgment, the renewables would still come if they are allowed, or they are they can compete the thermal out of the market, that the thermal closes and they occupy that kind of. But there are many issues connected with the load management and other kind of things. And the last one, which perhaps is going to sort of act as a spanner in the works, is the failure of the payment to the renewable generators. So what I have seen in last 1 year or so, the new intention or new projects announcement for renewables are going down. It is virtually, they had expected the SECI and others to sort of be assured, to assure them of their payments. That has not happened. At many places they are suffering. So my sense is that in times to come, at least for next 2-3 years, there would be a much smaller expansion of renewables than what the country needs and should have.
There may also be smaller expansion overall as well.
Rahul, the issue is that as far as renewables are concerned, we have to look at it from an environmental perspective also, not just from an, but I'm saying that's also the broad canvas against which we are looking at it. We have thermal plants, and I'm happy that the CEA, the Central Electricity Authority, has been doing excellent work in terms of retiring the plants. But there are still many, many inefficient, guzzling thermal plants which can be retired. So you will create space, number one. Number two, there's
But sir, what are the instruments for that? In the sense, these may be inefficient, but they look cheap in current framework. In the current pricing framework, they appear cheap to the...
They have BPS to supply.
No, the state government, they are mostly state-run plants.
Yeah.
So the state government doesn't have a very good track record of making payments to their own plants. Please.
Very bad.
It's not. So for them, this argument of cheapness is because they are not paying anything. So obviously it is cheaper. But they are terribly, terribly inefficient. And I'm so glad that the CA is now taking steps. They have retired a lot of them. I wish they retire more. There's more renewable space there. The problem is in terms of solar. You see, solar, our imports were from China and Malaysia. Now, I don't know the politics of it, nor do I know the security concerns, but Chinese imports are going to be a lot more difficult to handle. So how we are going to deal with that? Because we don't have any manufacturing capacity as such in terms of solar. Now, how we are going to navigate through that is something that I suppose better minds than mine would work out. But definitely renewables is one area which would need to be looked at. And I'm going to hang myself out on a limb, and everybody is going to get after me, because I am saying it's time for India to look at large hydro. And the environmentalists may please not throw stones at me, but we need to look at large hydro. I'll keep quiet after this.
Rahul.
Thank you. Sorry, before we, sorry, Dr. Verma, we've already exhausted our time, but hopefully not exhausted ourselves. So with your permission, if we could just continue a few more minutes, because there's 1 or 2 points, and I then wanted to hand over to you to give closing thoughts or maybe your magic wand suggestions. So please prep those as well. So if it's all right.
So Rahul, just on this renewable, the costing of the renewable is also to be seen in association with the concession that you have awarded to them in terms of socialization of the transmission cost and all. And the second, no amount of wind and solar can fend for the entire power demand of country in the recent future, you can say, the near future, unless you develop a proper storage capacity. And storage capacity is not possible at present with the kind of technology and resources we have in the battery.
Rahul, you can go on for some more time, but I have a commitment at 5:30. So I think if we can wind up in 5
yes,
10 minutes.
Definitely, just 5 minutes more.
So cost is to be seen in that. But at the same time, I agree fully with Mr. Pradhan that we have to look from the environmental angle. I'm otherwise also a forester. So you see that you have to promote your rooftop solars. It will reduce the power bill of the consumers who also want to save something on the power expenditure front. So rooftop solar you should promote. Don't go for heavy generators in the coming days when you are negotiating with the COVID inflicted economy. Don't go for that. Your estate sector plants are really very inefficient, and as per the Supreme Court direction, they are supposed to go for the FGD, and it entails certain cost and increase the tariff of the power, and therefore it's always better to close them down. So these are 2-3 aspects that I wanted to share.
So I think Mr. Pradhan had a view on that, but we can come back to that maybe in a minute. But one question that got asked was about the regulator versus the DisCom or the state. You have multiple entities setting rules for this temporary period. Coming back to the earliest part of our discussion on force majeure and short term, there is some fear that people are abusing or can abuse force majeure because you have different entities with different incentives. So just by saying you are a must-run entity doesn't mean that every cog in the wheel is actually running equally. And so there is this worry of force majeure being used or abused. So there are people saying, what about my PPA? Because cheaper power is there in the power exchange. Any thoughts on who gets to set the rules for the short term? Is it the regulator's job to actually declare? Because the original force majeure was more for a certain banking level side. So finance ministry had, I think back in February 20th, issued the first office memorandum for declaring force majeure, COVID as a force majeure. But that is on the fiscal side as opposed to the kilowatt hour side. So who would sort of step in and take the call and sort of apportion who can do what? And any thoughts on that? Because otherwise it's going to be almost the extreme solution, which is litigation based.
Can I make a small point on this? You see, in most of our renewable contracts, force majeure is very clearly written how the epidemic or pandemic will make a force majeure situation. Force majeure is a concept which is operated through the law of contract. And so two parties have already entered into a contract and decided what constitutes the force majeure and what not constitutes the force majeure. So in most of the contract, it is very explicitly written, and epidemic and pandemic is included in that. So I don't think there is any region of conflict. It has happened only because the RE operators as well as the MNRE went on saying that because it is a must-run situation, so it can't be treated under the force majeure. But I have also gone on record and tweeting that the contracts between the developer and the consumer, the DisCom, very clearly writes that epidemic or pandemic constitute a force majeure for the RE generators.
Rahul, force majeure is something that the regulator will have to decide on, and rule on. It's not something which can be decided outside the regulatory framework. So it will have to be the regulator, and I'm sure the regulator will apply their minds and decide on it. My only remark on this is that the CRC as regulator did intervene when there was a government order of the government of Indonesia raising the price of coal. So the CRC did intervene at that time. So it's not as if that the regulator is constrained to intervene. So where required, I think the regulator will intervene, but it's a call to be taken by the regulator. There's no point in banding around that it is a force measure, it isn't a force measure. It's something that the regulator has to regulate to rule on. That's the basic thing.
I think CRC has already ruled on that, sir. Recently, they considered.
I don't know. I've been out of touch, Verma ji.
They have considered it a force measure.
Then it's
okay. So last question, summarizing, sort of trying to put it together. What do you think a reset can look like? So let us assume there's an attempt to segregate the past and the future. That's one way of slicing it, because the future is about not just the recovery, but it's intertwines with where we want to go. While the past, our present actions were all gearing towards legacy issues, the elephants in the room, so to speak, Mr. Pradhan, to use your phrase. And so, is there a way to do a reset? Is it such that we sort of, as one example thrown out was, we separate the cross subsidy and then do efficient pricing, incentivize, sort of give SMEs, MSMEs and industry affordable power to kickstart them? How can we do this reset or segregation? Is it a need for regulation? Is it a need of cash? Because from the DisCom perspective, they still have to stay whole. If they don't do it now, and we just punt the can, use force majeure or some other methods, somewhere that free lunch is going to be paid by someone else down the road. So what does a reset, or what does this really look like going forward? Sort of open last question.
I have a one line answer to that. A reset is only possible if there is a political will across the country. That's it.
I have the point to make on this. Number one, the COVID affected economy much worse than the power sector. Power sector is still held up because of the domestic demand and a lot of work shifted to home. It is not shuttered. We could save, we could have 70% or 75% of the normal demand. Second, I think this is the time to sort of take up the long-term issues, to reset the power sector for a strong, viable, functional period to come. And that required, to my mind, two steps to be taken very quickly. Number one, get the stranglehold on the power, on the private sector supply out. 3 measures there: get the cross subsidy out, don't overprice the power, and let the private sector industry buy power from wherever they can rather than being obliged. And finally, the deliverance for the state governments, for the DisComs, etc., lies in the solution of taking the the DisComs, or the distribution, not DisComs, distribution towards the privatization. One doesn't have to do it everywhere. You have to begin where the case is the strongest. That means the losses are most. It's a cash business. Using technology can make the distribution pay for it. If in the rural areas the telecom companies can collect all their dues, I am quite certain that the power dues can be collected at much less cost, and therefore the distribution privatization should be front-loaded or should be brought on our agenda as the case may be. I think these are the 3 points which I want.
Dr. Verma, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, one small remark. I mean, privatization is welcome, but even government-owned DisComs can change its way of management. It's not the ownership which matters, but it's the management style which matters. Whether you have a principles of commercial operations or not, whether you are transparent or not, whether you are making your book account proper or not. So all these things has to be looked after. In our country, we cannot have 100% private DisComs, like 100% healthcare, privatized healthcare you cannot have. Had you got 100% privatized healthcare, COVID, you would not have been in a position to handle the COVID. Similarly, you will have to have a mix of both. You have to choose, you have to make a selection and do an operation kind of thing. That's the situation.
So thank you for extremely illuminating and thought-provoking both answers and questions. I wouldn't claim that we've come up with the answers, but I think we've sharpened some of the questions, which is itself the first step, and also come up with some insights that I think will be valuable to policymakers. We will be writing this up. We aim to have more sessions on complementary topics, including the Electricity Act amendments and smart metering and a few other things of relevance now. Thank you to all the participants, the hundreds of folks who joined us, but also many folks who gave questions. I've shamelessly usurped many of them and unfolded them into our discussions here, so I've benefited. But I think all of us have benefited from our wonderful and distinguished panelists. So thank you, for joining us.
Thank you, Rahul.
Very much.
Thank you, Rahul. Thank you.
Goodbye.